the grand moments, but also the small humiliations of a writer trying to cobble together a living.
Well, since you mentioned your agent, there's a very lovely scene in your book about when Arthur Less goes for lunch with his agent. And he's, you know, it's actually very beautiful because as a writer, you tend to, you know, you're so reliant on this person's reading of your work. And I think he's kind of halfway in love with his agent. And is that something you found in your relationship with?
Am I in love with my agent? Am I going to say it here in Jaipur? Absolutely. I will say the novel is not completely autobiographical. I was very careful not to put my agent in there as the agent. I invented someone brand new. But the relationship with the agent is peculiar because they're the only, you're wanting someone to tell you it's wonderful. And the only person who's seeing it is the one person who won't let you write a bad book, so they're not going to tell you it's wonderful unless it really is. And so it's terrifying.
And one more quickly. So there's so many wonderful writers who've actually written about the act of, you know, who've written novels about the act of writing or the writer's life. You know, you have Nabokov or you know, like all sorts of writers. Did you feel the weight of all of that, you know, all these classics of literature that already stand behind you? And did you feel that you had to hit a certain standard because you're writing about this writer's life?
I did think that there's something incredibly indulgent, for me at least, to write about being a writer. I feel maybe I only get to do it once because it's so obviously autobiographical in some ways. You can do it a few more times. I'm feeling nervous about it. But in fact, thinking of all these writers, you said Bulgakov too, I'd forgotten about that, and Nabokov and Updike and Roth and on, it actually gave me total permission to do what I wanted to do. And all of those are comic novels, because to write self-indulgently about being a writer seems just over the top. Like, I can indulge in the other fiction about people who are not like me, but writing about a writer, it's so painful, I can only make it funny in some way, if they're like me.
Hi, Anita. So your book is very different. It's not, in that sense, it's not about a writer's life in the same way that Andrew's is. So could you tell the audience a little bit about how the book works for those who haven't read it? You know, how you came to the project, what it's about.
Hello. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yeah. Eating Wasps is pretty much a book about a writer who lived 50 years ago, and she decides to kill herself for a number of reasons. But one of the primary reasons, of course, is that she's unable to write anymore. And what she has written creates a huge amount of speculation about her character and about her as a woman, etc. So she, you know, in a moment of absolute desolate feeling, she decides to kill herself. But that isn't the only reason. But then what happens is that 50 years after she has died and has been cremated and so on, there is something that happens in a particular resort in Kerala, from where, you know, a fragment of her bone is found, and that bone becomes like a collector of stories. And so she starts evaluating her life against the lives of the various people who come into her passage through the resort. So it is the story of a writer. It is the story of what a writer has to go through, especially a writer who lived in 1965. But more than that, it's also the story of her own choices as a woman and her own choices as somebody who chooses to write a fiction of a certain kind?
I wanted to ask you a little bit more about this, the device that you use, the central device of this finger that moves between all these various lives. As you said, I mean, you described it right now, but it is pretty macabre. Like, it is a kind of very strange thing that this is this kind of dead woman's finger that moves between all these various lives, and then you use that to investigate each of these lives. So what made you come to this, and how did you envision it? What did you think what were you trying to convey?
Yeah, okay, so I'd have start off with a confession. I'm still somebody who writes longhand, and for whatever reason, I hold my pen in a particular way, because of which I have a huge callus on my ring finger, which is not the finger you actually use when holding a pen. So this is something that has always been pointed out to me by various people, especially when I was in school. My teachers would pull me up and say, is this any way to hold a pen? Because I would be holding it like I was holding a stylus. And so when I started writing this book, and I was thinking of a particular device, and I said 1965, obviously this lady is not going to be using a laptop or a desktop. And I didn't think she would be using a typewriter either, because there's also a certain amount of romanticism to actually writing or longhand, using a fountain pen, etc. And so I imagined her using her, just like I use my ring finger, her using her index finger in a particular way so that it forms a callus there. And at some point, she does actually tell her lover that it's her guiding finger. So when she is cremated and, you know, he goes looking for a keepsake, he picks a fragment of a bone from her hand, which is actually the index finger. It is macabre, I agree now, in retrospect, yes. But at that point, it seemed like the most logical, you know, solution for me to use as a device. And in my mind, it was pretty much like a baton when you play a relay. You know, when you run a relay, it's a baton that goes from the runner 1 to runner 2, etc. So pretty much, this is what I wanted this index finger to do. I mean, the bone of the index finger to do. And she actually is embodied in the bone, and the character of the writer comes alive through the bone. So in my mind, yes, this was a ghost story. This was also, you know, plumbing really the darkness of the places a writer can go to. And it just seemed kind of appropriate for me to choose a rather macabre device rather than a palatable one.
Thanks. Would you like to read a little bit from your work?
I'm going to read from the prologue, and then I'm just going to read a tiny other segment just to kind of give you an understanding of this person called Sri Lakshmi, who is the character of this book. On the day I killed myself, it was clear and bright. It was a Monday, a working day. 25th October 1965, a day just like every other day, except I was dead, and the world ground to an abrupt halt as the news spread. People everywhere, in homes and alleys, in tea shops and at the railway station, the court and the college hostel, Swami's printing press and the King George market. Those who knew me and those who didn't all looked at each other and then looked away. She's dead, they said. She killed herself. Is that true? There isn't a suicide note. Was it a murder made to look like a suicide? They tried to explain my death. She had an incurable disease. She was in love with a married man. She was in love with a man who dumped her. She was pregnant. She was depressed. Something humiliating happened at the college which led to this. The speculation was as dense as the grief. An ordinary woman had become a legend, a tragic heroine, and it was the nature of my death that had turned me into someone extraordinary in their eyes. I was Kerala's Virginia Woolf. We even had the same bristling, brooding gaze a well-known artist claimed. Everyone, even those who didn't know me, added to the legend of Sri Lakshmi. Ghosts and writers are more alike than you think. We can be what you want us to be. We can hear your thoughts even if you don't tell us. We can read the silences and shape your stories as if they happened to us. And I was both a ghost and a writer.
And I have a question. Maybe you're already going to ask this, but what I'm curious about for you is, it's an imagined writer, but how were you able to take your own experience as a writer and put it into the mind of a woman from 50 years ago? Did some of it come from your experiences or things you'd read, or?
So I do think that many things have changed from 1965, but many things haven't at all. You know, the way a writer is perceived, what she can write about, and how it is viewed by, you know, an average reader. For instance, I mean, one of the things that happens to me constantly is that there is a lot of, I won't call it erotica, but there's a certain amount of sex in my writing. So the presumption is that I'm like, you know, banging everybody that I can see. So I get these guys hitting on me, people who send me pictures of their genitalia and stuff like that and so on. But it's basically a kind of, you know, assumption that this is, and the thing is, the character in my book, she writes what would be considered erotica for that period of time. And again, she goes through that same experience. So some of it I did draw upon from my own life in terms of what happens to a writer when she writes a certain kind of fiction. But also, I think that also the thing about understanding the creative process, I don't think it's very different for any of us sitting here. You know, I think ultimately what we do to arrive at a story and how we set about writing a story, we might have, you know, it's like saying that there are different symptoms, but ultimately the disease is the same. So I think it wasn't very hard for me to actually step into her shoes and so on.
Was it, I know you said the book was hard for you to write. Was it hard to step into her shoes, to go into yourself that way?
Well, it was hard for me to write because it was about getting into a point where I had to understand what can drive a person to kill herself, you know, and that is a very, very dark place to enter into your own mind and into your own soul, and to say that what is going to drive me to kill myself? What is that excruciating circumstance or set of circumstances that can make me feel that I can't go anymore, I can't go on anymore? So I have to imagine that. I may not have those circumstances, but I have to imagine it. And then there comes a point where you stop being, I mean, I stopped being me, and I started being this character. So much so, one of those, I mean, I remember this. I woke up in the middle of the night one time wanting to write a poem about jealousy, because there is this character who's in love with this married man, and she's imagining what he must be doing. And so the poem came from her. It didn't come from me. So you stop, I mean, I stopped being myself and I started being her. So it was almost disassociative behavior. So it's a huge toll on your own personality, on your own life, because I look at my family, my husband and son, my parents, my brother, and so on, and I'm like, who are these people? You know? I mean, so it isn't easy, really.
Sorry, I didn't want to start interviewing. I was just curious.
Thanks,
we hadn't talked enough.
Thanks very much. That was my main question to
Was
her.
it really? Yeah.
Okay.
He has to enter the password on his iPad to get to his notes. I feel.
And I'm
Now I
failing.
know your password.
So does everyone, don't worry. Andrew, would you read us a bit of your novel, please?
Yeah. Let me read. You know, I've never read this part before, but it's the part that takes place in Kerala. So I thought, I'll read it. I think it also demonstrates I had two rules for myself writing this book. It's about a writer who's trying to escape a wedding invitation. So he accepts invitations to events around the world, and his penultimate one is in India. And my first rule was that the joke was always on Arthur Less, the American, because he's the one who's in the wrong place, and he's doing the wrong things, and is making mistakes. And the second one was that I could only write down details that I had written in my notebook when I was traveling. Not even things I remembered. I had to have them written down because I didn't want to write some fantasy of another country, because I think that's a mistake American writers do. And when I wrote the Indian chapter, what I didn't want to write was the white man getting off the plane and being overwhelmed. It's gone out. The sights and sounds of, I just think I'd seen that a million times, and it's not pleasant to read. So I started it instead with a young Indian boy watching Arthur. Good. Is this going? Okay. For a 7-year-old boy, the boredom of sitting in an airport lounge is rivaled only by lying convalescent in bed. This particular boy, should I take yours? Yeah. I think it's wet. This particular boy, 1/6,000th of whose life has already been squandered in this airport, has gone through every pocket of his mother's purse and found nothing of interest but a keychain made of plastic crystals. He's considering the waste paper basket. Its swinging lid holds possibilities when he notices through the lounge's windows the American. The boy has not seen one all day. He watches the American with the same detached, merciless fascination with which he has watched the robotic scorpions that circle the airport bathroom drain. Epically tall, brutally blonde, the American stands in his beige, wilted linen shirt and pants, smiling at the escalator regulation sign. The sign, so scrupulously unabridged that it includes advice on pet safety, is longer than the escalator itself. This seems to amuse the American. The boy watches as the man pats every pocket on his person, then nods in satisfaction. He looks up at a closed-circuit television to follow the fleeting romances between flights and gates, then heads down to join a line. Though everyone has already passed through at least 3 checkpoints, a man at the head of the line has everyone take out their passport and boarding pass once more. This superfluous verification also seems to amuse the American, but it is warranted. At least 3 people are about to board the wrong plane. The American is one of them. Who knows what adventures awaited him in Hyderabad? We will never know, for he is shown to another gate, Thiruvananthapuram. He becomes absorbed in a notebook. Soon enough, a worker is rushing over to tap the American on the shoulder, and the foreigner pops up to rush for the flight that he is yet again about to miss. They disappear together down a foreshortened corridor. The boy, already attuned to comedy at his young age, presses his nose against the glass and awaits the inevitable. A moment later, the American springs back to grab the forgotten satchel and vanishes again, this time surely for good. The boy tilts his head as boredom begins to flood. His mother asks if he needs to wee, and he says yes, but only so he can see the scorpions again.
Thank you both.
Something's happening.
Hello?
Persevere.
Okay, I'll try. So thank you both. Lovely. So for those of you who aren't aware, Andrew won the Pulitzer Prize this year for fiction.
I did.
That's serious. I know you Jaipur audiences are very jaded. You get to see all sorts of writers, but that's as big as it gets. So I wanted to talk about this character because, I mean, it's kind of Arthur Less, your central character, the character the book is about, is a writer who's struggling for recognition. He's struggling to, he has to contend with the fact that he's not the literary superstar that he imagined himself that he imagined he'd be. And, this is, I mean, I feel like this is something that every writer has to confront at some point or the other in their career. I imagine. So, did you? This is a 2-part question. Did you draw upon your own anxieties as a writer when you were constructing this character of Arthur Less? And has the Pulitzer suddenly freed you from all those anxieties? Are you suddenly...
You ask her very reasonable questions. I'm asked if I'm in love with my agent and what are my deepest anxieties. I did draw upon my anxieties, but they're the ones I think most writers have. We usually at festivals like this present ourselves very dignified and confident about our books, and usually we are at this moment of publication, but during the process of writing them, we're wrestling with doubt and insecurity the whole time. And then unfortunately, often afterwards, the doubt and insecurity hasn't gone away when we're brought to some place like this and it rains on your big day, you know, and you're like, oh gosh, is anyone gonna come, you know? And even a Pulitzer Prize doesn't take away the feeling of like, they're never gonna come. It's not happening. So I drew on a lot of those. I think I'm released from a great deal of that anxiety these days, luckily.
Yeah, because it's quite, we were talking about this earlier, but it's almost prophetic, your book, because in this book, Arthur Less's boyfriend, former boyfriend, wins the Pulitzer, and then, he's sort of struggling for his own place in the pantheon, and then he goes on this world tour, and he finds a kind of satisfaction, not just, in himself as a writer, but also emotionally with his relationships. Do you find that you sort of like, did you predict the future? Do you sort of?
Yes, I can predict the future.
So what's your next novel about?
Every book I write comes true. It's like I'm a demon of some kind. No one is more surprised than I that I won the Pulitzer Prize. And the proof of it is that it's played for comedy in the book that anyone would win the Pulitzer Prize. It's the most shocking thing that could happen, which I find funny. There's even a character that goes up to our Arthur Less and says to him, don't win a prize, your life will be over. All you will do is tour around the world and never write again. And here I am. So yes.
I'm sorry, you brought up that writer. I remember that scene in the book. It's beautifully written, and I wasn't going to bring this up, but you did point. I think there's a conversation that they have where, and this novel is so beautifully done, and it really captures a lot about what, the kind of turmoil you go through as a writer. But there was one note I found was inauthentic, or which I found a little troubling, which was when this writer comes up to him and says, you're not part of the canon. And he's kind of confused, and he's like, what canon? And I feel like any writer is going to know exactly what that means as soon as that's said to him.
Yeah, the joke is he thinks that he means like a cannon that you shoot someone out of at the circus, and he says, I really feel like I am in the canon these days. Oh no, the literary canon. Yeah, I know, it's a reach, but who would ever think they're in some kind of canon of some kind? At our young age.
So he was being facetious. He was dismissing it.
Yeah, I think it would never occur to him. The character is mostly, he has a sort of divine innocence that this is why he stumbles through the world and survives it, because it would never occur to him that he would be in some kind of canon.
Right.
But you're right, he would know the word.
So this is something that Andrew already brought up. Thank you very much. But so one of the reasons Sri Lakshmi, your writer character, faces the trouble she does is because she writes so openly, fearlessly about sex. And as a woman writer, is that something that you struggle with? Is it something that how much of yourself to be true to, how much of yourself to put in there, because you feel like there are people judging. Especially in a country like India, there is a kind of, it's not only readers, but it's also other writers. There's a kind of literary establishment that is also judging you. And I know it happened to a friend of mine, Meenakshi Madhavan. In Kerala, it's very strong, and they sort of attack you if you write about dating even, So.
No, it hasn't bothered me at all. Yes, obviously there is a certain amount of speculation, which is what I talked about earlier and so on. I remember when one of my, in the early part of my career, a journalist asking me, doesn't it bother you that your mother would read what you've written? And I'm like, no, it doesn't bother me at all. Because, I mean, I've said this again and again and over again, but I write about food, and so the same amount of passion and love that I put into my food writing is precisely what I would put into sex, because for me it's just another appetite. It's nothing beyond that, you know. And I use when I bring in sex, I don't use it to titillate. I use it as a device. It could be something to show wonderful tenderness. It could be something to show rage. It could be something to show abuse. It could be something to show togetherness. So I use it as a device, just as I would describe probably a samosa or something, you know. So it's pretty much the same kind of, I think the same kind of levity I would give it, and the same kind of seriousness I would give it. So, no, it doesn't bother me at all. I remember, again, my mother telling me when she read something that I'd written initially, when I was really young, and she said, you know, I mean, all of us do it, but do you have to write about it? And I said, well, you know, somebody has to write about it. And then after that, she's never, ever mentioned the subject to me.
But have you faced a lot of flack from writers or the kind of literary establishment?
No, I don't think, not from the literary establishment, though I do see how lazy the media can be when they just kind of, you know, just pigeonhole you and say that, oh, she writes about women's lives and she writes about sex. You know, I mean, seriously, I write about other things too, you know, but why do you just have to kind of, you know, spotlight only two particular areas? Because, you know, and I think it's basically, it's just laziness, because you're looking for pegs to hang the story from. And these are, you know, two pegs that actually will bring in readership. So, yeah.
Okay. Well, as a sometimes member of the media, I agree, we can be very lazy. So you talked about your samosa, you know, the samosa analogy is great. Can you tell us, you know, one of the things that you do really well is you move between genres. You write murder fiction, you write children's books. I didn't realize you wrote about food also, and you write literary fiction. How is it to like straddle all these kind of genres and, you know, walk between them?
So I think in many ways, you know, I have these multiple stories running in my head, and I think the genre comes from based on the story. It's not as though I say that I'm going to write a book of literary fiction, or I'm going to write a noir novel or a children's novel. So I start with a story, and then as I'm writing it, I realize that this story is going to work well for, you know, if I were to write it in this way. So when I write noir, I just decided at some point I could have written it as a literary novel too. What I did was take the learnings from literary fiction and bring it into noir, so it becomes like literary noir. And then I realized that when I was writing Eating Wasps, I was bringing in some of the noir elements into the writing of this. So the pace becomes, you know, much more quicker than that of a literary novel. And so children's fiction is like, since I write very dark fiction, adult fiction, children's fiction is something that I do to redeem my own soul, redeem my own, hopefully, innocence of my soul. I need to feel that there is a beautiful world out there. It's not about darkness alone. So I enter that spectrum when I write for children's fiction. So I think I alternate between genres because I need to kind of, because that's what I do as a full-time writer. I need to, A, make it exciting for myself, and B, I need to actually be able to, you know, balance it out. Otherwise, I would be this absolute nervous wreck.
But do you find this concept of genre in writing, you know, there's, as you say, your books sort of will move between, and this is for you also, Arthur? Sorry, Arthur. Andrew.
Not Arthur.
Sorry.
That's not the agent from the novel.
This is the whiskey. So, do you find that this idea of genre in fiction is that useful? Is it limiting? Do you find that, you know, because you've written a comic novel and you've written other kinds of novels before, do you think that this is something that, you know, is it something that publishers think of more and readers think of more than writers themselves when you're starting out to work on a novel?
I think that, yeah. I mean, don't you think listening to her description of how she put literary elements into noir and noir elements into this book makes you more interested in reading the books, right? Because it sounds like something happens. She's using the narrative propulsion that comes from so-called genre fiction and the language. That's the kind of books I love to read. Entertaining books that are also, well, I mean, you're looking for a book that has every kind of reading pleasure, that has language pleasure and philosophical ideas, emotional ones, that's maybe funny and is fast moving and with a surprise. All those things in reading would be great to have in one book. And so it sounds like you're doing that. And I think I tried to do it in this book to make it, I don't think there's anything wrong with a book being a pleasure to read. I don't think that's a sin. Yeah, you know?
Absolutely, I think so too. I think, you know, I mean, just because a book, a novel is literary doesn't mean it has to be dense and boring. You know, it has to ultimately, as a reader, you need to get something out of that book, some amount of pleasure, not just learning and, you know, philosophical insights and stuff like that. So, I mean, I don't like the idea of genres because I think that it's, again, pigeonholing, which I'm not comfortable at all. But yes, I do understand the distinction between writing for adults and writing for children, because obviously the tone of voice is slightly different. And if you're going to be talking to a 7-year-old child, you cannot talk to a 7-year-old child like you're talking to a 19-year-old woman or a 19-year-old man. There's a slight world of difference there in terms of even vocabulary and everything. So that is about the only distinction that I really am willing to, you know, settle on, which is writing for children and writing for adults. But apart from that, I think fiction is fiction. You know, there is really no need to kind of break it up simply because there are bookshelves and you want to say Indian writing in English, or you want to say like science fiction, you know, or dystopian fiction, that kind of thing. I mean, these are artificial labels, really.
Thanks. Andrew, you pointed out in, I was watching an interview you gave on YouTube, and you pointed out that, you pointed out that yours was the first humorous work to win the Pulitzer since, I think you said
Confederacy of Dunces, I think so, yeah.
So why do you think that
80s.
Is there, do you think that there's a kind of, why do you think that humorous works don't win the biggest literary prizes?
Oh gosh, well, I am not on the Pulitzer Prize committee, so thank God.
Well, you won it, so you're entitled to talk about it.
I don't know if I would have given it to me, but I would have, I mean, I think it turns out when you talk to people about their favorite books, they say books that they're proud to say they've read, and they say, what's your real favorite? It will often be, they're not going to say War and Peace. They're going to say something that they turn to every year to read, to comfort them, or that's like a good friend of theirs, which is often a comic novel, you know? And I don't think you should be ashamed of that, no matter what it is. I think, you know, there's Graham Greene, who I don't like all of his books anymore, but Travels with My Aunt is a book that I just love. And for him, it was an entertainment, but I think it's his best. And it's a joy to now get to travel around and have more people read my book and to tell me they found it funny, but that they were moved by it also. Because there's an American comedian, Joan Rivers, who said something great once. During one of her stand-up routines, she's a very crass comedian, and she told a joke about deaf people, and someone from the audience said, "My sister's deaf, that's not funny." And she said, "My mother's deaf. You stupid idiot. What do you think comedy is?" She said, "Comedy is when we take out the stuff and we look at it and we face it together. That's what comedy is." And I feel it's arrogant for me to say I've written a book where I've brought out all this stuff for everyone to face, but this is embarrassing stuff for me to talk about being a writer or being gay or the humiliations of middle age, you know, and to now see how many people are reading about it is a little shocking, but it's the hard stuff that made me make it into a comedy.
Yeah, for all the books to be successful, this one. I mean, to
I
be
know, this is the one.
Success.
I wrote all these, you know, stately, elegant novels before, and then this one, which is vulgar and exuberant.
Not at all. It's very stately and very elegant.
Oh, thank you.
Anita, your book is very deeply embedded in a place, Kerala. You know, it's most of the characters, almost all the characters, I think. And it's also very evocative of Kerala and also sort of the values and the customs. Do you find yourself drawn to this idea of home? I mean, you are Malayali. Do you find yourself drawn to this idea of home when you write? Is that something that you turn to again and again?
I think the reason I write about Kerala is because I know the place best. I understand the people, I understand how their minds work, I understand the psyche of the state, the psyche of the people, I mean, the tiny little nuances, all of which interest me as a writer, and I know that I can mine it for literary embellishment if I were to, you know, wanted to do that. You know, I ultimately was able to write about Bangalore only when I was able to write my crime, because I don't think I understand the Kannadiga mindset as well as I do the Malayali mindset, you know. So I don't want to enter into a space that I'm not sure of, and because I know then it'll be speculative. Whereas here, I know that I'm drawing on reality and then building on it. So I guess that's why Kerala keeps featuring in my work again and again.
Andrew, your book moves across the world. Do you find that there's a kind of, I mean, do you find yourself with this idea of home? I mean, do you think that there's something that you return to time again? Is there such a thing as a writer's home?
It sounds like you have one. I'm from San Francisco in California. That's my home, but it's not where I was born. It's typical of Americans that we're born somewhere and we move 4,000 miles away and live there, and it's typical also to continue to travel and to be a little uprooted. America's also not my favorite country to be in at the moment, honestly, so I don't mind moving around from it, but I also find that when I travel, if I'm stuck on a novel, which I am now, that if I stay home, I'm sort of in my office and it's blank. And that's the hard place to be. And if I travel, I get so thrown off of my expectations that I start to pay attention to detail a lot more because I'm terrified I'm going to miss the boarding time for my plane or something. So I'm looking at everything much more attentively, especially if I'm alone. And that's a good state for a writer, to be paying attention, because I think it's kind of our job. And I understand why you would want to base it in your home where you know the details, because I think most people, it's painful all day to go through the day, to pay attention all the time. It's too much to do, and so you look at your phone, or you blank out at the bus stop and you miss all the things that are going on. And then for me, what I love when I read especially poets is that they pay attention and remind us of what we kind of pass by every day. And I would love to be able to do that, and usually not being at home helps me gather the details for it. Even if I'm not going to write about India, I'm looking at people, really. And then I go home, lock myself in that room, and write it.
So do you feel like you don't keep your eyes as open when you're at home? I mean, because there's so much going on, or...
Yeah, I think I'm not... Yeah, I can get very lazy about it. I have a very regular pattern. One of my oldest, dearest friends is here with me, and we go to the same bar every Friday. I could barely describe it to you. I've seen it so many times. That's the problem with it. and breaking out of that pattern helps me recognize what I'm not seeing.
Okay, we're kind of running out of time. I want to open it up for a few questions, but I'll ask one more question to both of you. Now, Less is about your novel is about these two kind of presiding relationships in Arthur Less's life. It's, you know, one where he's, when he's a young man and he falls in love with an older poet, and also about when he's older himself and, you know, there's a younger man who he falls in love with and falls in love with him. So, you know, why did you, what were you trying to convey with that kind of circularity or that echo within Arthur Less's life, where he's young and he goes through a certain experience with an older writer, and then he sort of takes on that role almost?
Well, I was interested. I've never had that experience of flipping that way myself, but I thought it would be interesting. It intrigued me, the idea of being the young lover, the desired one, and then reaching some kind of age where it turns out that's no longer you, and you're some older lover, a completely different role, and how it can happen to anyone, straight or gay, but I think especially gay men it may happen, because there's no gender issue about what roles you're supposed to play. And I thought it would be fun to force him to mirror his life that way. It's structural, too, for writers to be able to have sort of bookends to things.
Thanks. That's great. Anita, last question, and then we'll open it up. You have, your novel has this kind of profusion of characters. There's all sorts of lives that it enters and walks out of. Some of them come back repeatedly. Some characters only appear once. You know, it's like a little vignette almost. You know, why did you think to write it this way? Why did you think to, I mean, and how do these lives enter one another? Like how, some of them don't enter one another at all. So how, you know, how is it like as a novel, how do they sort of work with each other? How do they fit with each other?
I think I have always had this abhorrence to writing very linear kind of novels. I guess I need to make it exciting for myself as a writer. When I'm writing it, I need to be able to, you know, wonder how am I going to meld these various lives together, and how am I going to be able to do it seamlessly. I guess, so there is one way of doing this where I could have, so initially in the first draft, it was a kind of linear novel, but you know, there was a point when I knew I wasn't satisfied with it because it wasn't working out. It was just too pat, really, more than anything else. And I said, I'd just go back and see how am I going to, if I were to be making a patchwork quilt, how would I do it? How do you take multiple pieces and create something that is a unified whole, which works together, but if you were to break it up, it won't work together either, you know? So I guess there's a teeny bit of narcissism here, where I feel like I need to be able to make that connection, which maybe another writer would do so in a different fashion. So, which is why this book evolved the way it does, or the way it did.
Well, it's wonderful. It worked out really well. Thank you both. It was really fun talking to you about the craft. And I hope there's some questions in the audience. Do you have the mic? Maybe her in the front?
Hi. So I wanted to ask you, at least personally,
Hold it up like a rock star. Yeah.
yeah, for me, a lot of the media that I've been exposed to regarding gay people, bisexual people, it tends to be very depressing. You know, it's always a young character, and you know, it's a confusing time in our lives. And your book is going to be the very first one I'm going to read that's funny, and as well it's about a middle-aged person. So how did you feel about sort of expanding the genre in that direction and creating a piece about, you know, gay people in their middle ages, which I think is not that common of a thing to see?
I'm glad to hear that. I do think I do think I felt there was a gap on my bookshelf where there was a story about two men in love that didn't end in misery and sorrow and suffering in some way. And I guess after many years of looking at my bookshelf, I said, I guess I'm going to have to write it, you know? But I think that's where a lot of books come from, is feeling that there's a gap somewhere. And also, the LGBT community certainly suffers around the world, more than in San Francisco. You know, it's a difficult time, not just with people's families, but with government situations, although things just got great here in India. And because I think I always felt like I didn't think being in love was gonna end in death. You know, I thought felt like joy to me, and then like terrible annoyance, and they don't fill the dishwasher properly, and you break up. But like, it was also, I thought that didn't come across somehow in books about gay people and trans people, that there's experience the same humiliations and petty moments and human experiences as other people, and I wanted to write that book because I was feeling that way. I wanted to write a book that had some feeling of joy about that human experience. And I'm sure it's not the only one that's ever been written. It's the only one I've ever written, so.
Hello. I'm a blogger and an aspiring writer. So as writers, I wanted to ask you this. Do you only write when you have a story, or do you actively go out looking for a story to write?
She writes constantly, nonstop, don't you? We were both amazed at that. Yeah, she's a true champ.
Well, I think, you know, obviously most writers have an idea kind of germinating in their head. Some of them take longer to put it down into words. I just like the idea of, you know, doing something every day, so I need to write. I'm a compulsive writer more than anything else, but that's not how most, or maybe all writers are. So there is no, but the one thing you need to definitely remember is that, you know, books won't get written on their own. They have to be written. So you have to sit down in front of your desktop or your laptop or your paper or whatever and give it a shot every day. And it's a standard thing of the more you write, the better your craft becomes. So I run a mentorship program, and I tell my writers that write 400 words a day. Don't write more than that, but just write 400 words a day. So it becomes like a discipline that you will never, ever, you know, ever put away. And I said, take a day off. Take a weekend. I mean, give yourself a Sunday or whatever day off. But, you know, if you do 6 days a week, you do 400 words, you have 2,400 words in a week, and in about 10 months' time, you will have a novel.
We live across the world from each other, but that's the only advice to give. It's exactly right. I admire so much that you can go so freshly into a novel, but I do, when I'm struggling with my novel, and maybe you should try this too, I write the pages anyway, you know, and they're terrible day after day, but it means that the novel is in my head instead of some TV show I was watching recently, you know? So that needs to be the thing you're obsessed with, is the novel, and not all the other things, not the news. It's very easy to get obsessed with the news, and it's not helping your book. And I'm saying this to you, but it's really to me, you know? Because I don't want to write those words because I feel like it's not going to be any good. But I write them anyway, and you know what? I looked over some today that I wrote a month ago. They weren't bad. At least they were there to look at.
I really enjoyed the talk. Andrew, just to clear any anxiety you might have had regarding today, I've been sitting here the entire day just so I could have a front row view to your talk.
In the rain?
Yes, with the rain, it was falling on me. I just bared through it just for your talk.
Oh, no.
But I really enjoyed it. It was worth it.
Thank you.
I had a question. because you had such, I mean, your characters traveling throughout the world, so you literally had the entire world on your plate. How did you end up choosing the locations that you did to base your character in? Did the locations come first, or did you go to those locations to do your research afterwards?
Maybe you find this too also, that you have some part of it planned very well, and some of it evolves from that. In order to make a living, a lot of writers do journalism, and I do food writing too, strangely. But I did travel writing because it pays really well, and you get to travel. And so I had actually ended up traveling to a bunch of places when I decided to make it into a book where he would move around the world. And so I picked up a couple already and had been taking notes, and I had to fill in, the blanks to get all the way around. So the trick was how to get to India and Japan without paying a dime. So I got one of those in-flight magazines, I pitched them stories to see if they would fly me out. So that's how I got around the world. I had a whole chapter in Vietnam, which I visited twice, that I cut after all of that. But, that's also part of it, is you have to be willing to let go of something if it doesn't belong in the book.
Greetings to the panel. Earlier, it was touched upon about writing in different genres. So I know for a fact that Anita ma'am has written across genres, and you mentioned that Mr. Greer also has written in a different genre before. Does writing in one genre and then going to the next, does that influence of the previous book come into the next book?
Well, I guess to some extent it does, because, obviously there's no way you can compartmentalize your writing into such ironclad chambers. But I think it works in a good way, because, ultimately the good things are the ones that kind of percolate into the different forms of writing that you do. I find, for instance, that when I'm writing for children, that I am able to be very funny, but I can't be very funny in my literary fiction. But when I'm writing noir, I'm able to bring the fun element there as well. So I mean, this is just giving you a random example. But I think it does help. And like I said, ultimately the writer is the same. It's just that the publishers and the booksellers decide that this has to be called this sort of a genre and so on. So I don't think it really makes that much of a difference to us as a writer.
Well, I'm very hard for my publicist, because every book I write is completely different from the last one without being able to be categorized in a new genre. So I wrote a straightforward literary novel, and then I wrote a kind of fantasy novel, and then I wrote a historical novel, and then a time travel novel was my last novel, and now a comedy. And I don't know what, I always get a different crowd at the readings, completely different. The last crowd has abandoned me totally. My agent is nodding, yes. So I think I really like the crowd I got for the comedic books, so I might stick with that for the next one. But it is tempting to just try something new, with so much in the world to write about. It would be fun to try my hand at a diamond heist, but it'd be awful, yeah.
I think we're about out of time. Maybe one more question? Okay, one last question. It's freezing up here, so please, let's keep it short. Yeah, it's really cold.
I'm glad I went to Fab India and bought this. I will say that.
Hello, Andrew. I want to ask a question from your book, from a line. Freddie Pillow is a man who doesn't need to be told before takeoff to secure his own oxygen mask before assisting others. Is this something about yourself, or can you describe?
How dare you? I am shocked to hear you say that line, because I used to people. Oh my gosh. I'm trying to hide it all in fiction, and here you all are ripping the seams apart. When people would ask me how I would describe myself, I would say, I am someone who does not need to be told to put on my oxygen mask first before assisting others. And so I gave it to someone else in the book because I was trying to hide it. But since you've asked honestly, I'll tell you, yes. Okay. That's how my family thinks of me. They find that very, very funny.
Thank you both very much, and thank you all for being here. This was a great discussion.
And thank you for leading this.
A lot of fun.
We wish to thank Andrew Sean Greer, Anita Nair,